my name is Lydia. I am speaking on Andrew Tate versus Jesus today. So, actually, I'm going to start us off. In my beautiful hometown of Wilmington, North Carolina, I would often visit Halliburton Park. This is a peaceful, beautiful place that was named in honor of William David Halliburton, Jr. He graduated from Lydia High School, which is just down the street from me. He was Christian. He attended seminary and enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve. He graduated from the Naval Hospital Course School and became a pharmacist mate second class. When World War II broke out, he was sent to the Pacific War Zone. After 6 months in Japan, he found himself in a battle on Okinawa with a Marine Rifle Company. He was pinned down by the Japanese machine gun and sniper fire. In the distance, across the battlefield, he saw a wounded man, a Marine, who was furthest away from the rest of the company. He immediately went over to the man and started administering aid to him. When the man was struck a second time by a bullet, Halliburton used his body to shield the man from further fire. He continued to administer aid despite mortal wounds from shrapnel and bullets. He heroically sacrificed himself so his comrade might live. He was 20 years old and gave his life for another man. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. So what made his actions honorable? Like, why would we consider that honorable? The fact that he sacrificed his life at 20 years old for someone else. And what makes this story different from other people, per se, in our generation today? What makes him manly? Any ideas? Yes.
He put himself in harm's way and kept himself in harm's way to help someone else, and ultimately sacrificed his life, which not a lot of people will do. Honestly, it's human nature to protect ourselves.
Anyone else?
It's a selfless act he did for which he had nothing to gain in return.
I'd say even the fact that it's not even necessarily a utilitarian action, that him trying to save him, you could make the argument that if you were trying to save as many lives as possible, that might not be the right decision, yet he still took the opportunity for the chance to save them.
So that's different from a lot of people today who just care about themselves. They don't really care about other people.
Well, that's a perfect transition into the next person I'd like to talk about, Miss Steve. Steve is an imaginary person. This was the first picture that showed up when I Googled Steve, so he's the guy we're going with. But Steve is an imaginary person. He's 20 years old. He's single. He's trying to make his way through college. Steve does not believe in God, but even if he did, he wouldn't have time to give him any attention. He wants to succeed academically to get a good job. He's ambitious. He's power hungry. He wants to have control over his own life. In other words, he's self-centered. He wants a good job. He wants people to like him. Maybe he wants a girlfriend. He wants people to see him as a man. But what is a man? Steve doesn't know. Steve didn't have a great father figure to be an example to him. So what determines manliness? Steve looks for an answer, so he hops on the internet, looks on YouTube, said, what's an example of a man? And the first thing that shows up is Andrew Tate. This guy. You might have heard of him. He is an established worldly definition of manhood. He's a former kickboxer who developed something called the Manosphere. He, among being in several court cases and random little things like that, publicly brags about pimping women, taking money from gullible men, and living as large of a life as possible. He developed this idea and an example of what the Manosphere was, and lives it out. He doesn't just say to do something, but he does it himself. So, the Manosphere. challenges feminism, which I talked about last semester, but if you weren't there, that was a fight to give women equal, if not more power than men have. And Manosphere challenges this. It is fighting to give men back the power that they once had before feminism came about. And honestly, it takes away any value that women have altogether. It celebrates masculinity. It advertises that men have to be strong and successful and good with women to have any sort of influence or power in this world. It promises to give men control over their own lives and promises ultimately fulfillment, which is also what feminism promised to women. It is, in a way, an overreaction to feminism, where feminism brought about things like no-fault divorce, where a woman could divorce her husband or vice versa for no reason at all. It takes that and moves it to the extreme, where now men don't even want to get married because they're afraid of a woman divorcing them, taking the kids, taking the money, and then having nothing left. So in their eyes now, it's safer to stay single than to be divorced. So this is the Manosphere that Andrew Tate developed. And there's a couple of terms that are often associated with it that you may see in the media or online relating to him. The first one is men going their own way, which discourages men from having committed relationships, kind of like what we were talking about before. It argues that men are penalized by having children and getting married in society at present. There's no real profit from it. It doesn't make any sense in their minds, because why have kids and get married when you can be successful and have a career and have all the money you want, or date around with no consequences? Red pill is a term from The Matrix. How many of you have seen The Matrix? Nice, I have not. I'm gonna watch that. So it can be used to refer to when people experience a sudden change of attitude towards politics, especially progressive ideology. So a sudden change comes about, just like taking the red pill. It can be used when people experience the unraveling of the feminist beliefs that were held before, and then they happen to see the truth of manliness and all of the things and all the opportunities that it presents itself with. The next one is MRAs, which are men's rights activists. This argues that family courts penalize men, and that current law and practice makes it difficult for divorced fathers to maintain relationships with their children. So once a divorce does happen, then men are seen as the bad guys in the situation. They can't visit their kids or spend any time with them, and they're always seen as the ones at fault. It also argues that there are harms committed by women, such as female and male domestic violence and abuse. So that's MRAs. And the last one, ours. A lot of advice gets thrown around from Andrew Tate and men like him about how to attract women and have sex with them, including manipulative and abusive behavior. So these are all the things that Andrew Tate is advocating for, some of the terms that are used, and just sort of the incentive behind what they're doing. So why has society become attracted to a role model like Andrew Tate? For this one, I'd like you to discuss with your neighbor, and we'll take a couple minutes to do that. So, what are some of our thoughts? And I know you guys have thoughts because you're talking about it.
I think that Andrew Tate has a lot of things that men want, but in terms of, like, I think it starts off as like he has these things, so whatever he's doing, I need to do it too. But he's very manipulative and he's a bit of an extremist. It's like, yes, men shouldn't be sexually or physically abused, but at the same time, should you take it to the point where women shouldn't have rights at all, you know, so.
One thing could be that some men might have lost either power or money or whatever, or some women they like kind of left them, so they feel like they can use this to kind of get back in position, because otherwise they feel insecure. So
The revenge, the
kind
revenge,
revenge,
yeah.
When everybody else seems to be saying that men are worthless and don't have any purpose, he at least is coming along and saying they do have a purpose.
Yeah, I think a lot of society is trying to emasculate men. I think a lot of people like believe that and feel that. And so the engineer talking about how Andrew Tate probably wouldn't have been doing what he's doing now anyway, but he's capitalizing on a growing market. I think the same thing is with like Jordan Peterson, but Jordan Peterson's like much more healthy approach to masculinity. That's a response to third feminism.
So similar to almost politically how it feels like people are incapable of separating very niche views within a subset of people as encompassing the whole. And so people see the much more small section that is like the hyper anti-men, and they attribute that to half the population rather than being that small subset, and therefore their reactionary response is I have to protect myself from half of the population, and he's the most outspoken voice about it.
Yes, mine is similar to what you said, where I think it's a bit of like a lack of discernment on a lot of people's parts. You know, so it's been said that discernment is not being able to tell the difference between right and wrong, but discernment is being able to tell the difference between right and almost right. And so I think a lot of what Andrew Tate says can be seen as almost right. It has kernels of truth in it, but it's mixed in with a lot of untruth. And I think people see the parts that have some tie to truth, and they think, oh, well, therefore all of it he says is true.
Like the truths that you were saying about, men versus women getting abused in certain situations, but then he's taking that to the extreme.
Yeah, or that everyone mentioned, right? Like even like the court cases and all that kind of stuff.
It's almost like a Trojan horse to get other views in, where it's like you can get them to agree with this thing, so that I can, if they agree with me on this, I can trust it.
Which is a common manipulation tactic, right?
It's like sociopathic. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, he's not the only one who's a role model, like you guys said. Like there are tons of people who have voices that people listen to, like Jordan Peterson. It's just what are they saying? And like, what is the thought process behind it? Like what's the morals behind it? Are there any morals behind it? Or are they just trying to give it an end that most people don't see? So, yeah. Cool. Good thoughts. I'm going to move into a little bit more of a biblical approach to these things. So that was kind of like the worldly side, and we're talking about the biblical side now. But definitely keep these parts of it in mind as we move forward. So the next thing I have is a verse. Can you guys read that? Is it big enough? Would someone want to read it out loud for me?
Sure. Up there.
I can. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Have nothing to do with such people. They are the kind who worm their ways into homes and gain control over gullible women, who are loaded down with sins and are swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth.
This was a pretty accurate picture of what's going on. Some of the things that caught my attention were talking about getting control over gullible, or sometimes I just say weak women who are looking for attention in the wrong places. Are definitely swayed by this. Both men and women in this situation are led astray by all sorts of evil desires and passions that are very humanly and just sinful natures to us. And the final part, never being able to arrive at the knowledge of truth. So when we think about like Steve at the beginning, where he's searching for an answer, he's searching for what does it mean to be a man, like what's my purpose, things like that, and it's this spiral that they go down, and they're always learning, but never able to come to the actual truth, which we will get to.
So are you saying that maybe Steve came to the knowledge of truth in his example?
I don't know if Steve came to the knowledge of the truth. We'll see at the end of the presentation. He comes to the knowledge. So, we have biblical examples of men. Before I get into these examples, I'm going to talk about the church a little bit. The church has this dichotomy going on, right? So we have the feminism side that I talked about last time, and then we have the masculine side we're talking about now. The church needs to figure out how to weigh these two in a biblical view. And in some ways, the church can push men towards the manosphere unintentionally. Churches nowadays are very feminine focused, whether it's the way that the service is organized or worship. A lot of things in a church service are very feelings based, which women like, and are a little bit more in tune with. Not that guys don't have feelings, I'm not saying that, but a lot of like the love songs and worship and things like that are definitely attractive to women. And so the church itself needs to be careful of that. And we do need more manly men, like we've had in church history. So whether it's more modern people, like the Halliburton example, or if it's examples from our Bibles when it talks about all these warriors in the Old and New Testament that we see as very manly examples of people, we need those in today's society. And we need people that honor the image of God in themselves and in women. So that's where the church is now. Some examples of manly men in the Bible. First of all, Jesus Christ. These are some things about him. He did not selfishly desire the things of the world. He healed the sick and cared for women. He showed humility to the Father. He was submissive to the Father. He's called the Prince of Peace. He sacrificed himself for humanity. He was the ultimate example of what a man could be. And he will return one day to fight the powers of darkness. So you have some examples of a very peaceful shepherd, but you also have a king and a warrior. And in a similar way, we have David. The warrior, he fought Goliath. We all know the story of David and Goliath. He was also a king. He ruled over all of Israel. But before all that, he was a shepherd. And he played the harp for the king. Almost got a spear thrown at him for it. He wrote Psalms. Some of the most touching pieces in our Bible are the Psalms. And he wept in front of his friends when he was getting surrounded. So these are examples in the Bible of men. And I would say they're not only descriptive, but also prescriptive in a way of how the Bible exemplifies how men should act. So, what is the primary difference between Andrew Tate and Jesus? And you can also include David as well if you would like. Talk amongst yourselves.
The hair.
It's vulnerability and compassion.
Vulnerability and compassion.
David and Jesus showed vulnerability around everyone and compassion, whereas Andrew Tate didn't really have compassion for everyone. And he did show a lot of vulnerability.
Hair, too. No, Andrew would demean women, Jesus would honor them.
Andrew Tate suffers persecution justly, and Jesus suffered persecution unjustly.
I like that.
I think how, as a group, me and David were talking about, it kind of reminds me of biblical examples of men. It almost reminds me of Roosevelt's Speak Softly and Carry a Big Stick, where it's be strong and reserve. And it's like Jesus and David's power and authority and strength were used for the purposes of peace and protection, versus Andrew Tate's being used for self-gratification.
Like their strength was used, David and Jesus were used when necessary and not necessary. power and they use it very well.
That's a really good example. I didn't even think about that, but biblical masculinity is based around meekness. Meekness in the sense of reserved power, like you said. And like Tate is quite the opposite of that, flaunting whatever you have. Generally speaking, that indicates some sort of insecurity when you're, having to flaunt whatever you are, compared to the call for biblical men to be meek.
It's also a matter of who they worship. Obviously, Jesus is God, but as human, he also worships God. And Andrew Tate worships himself.
Yeah, imagine that. Andrew Tate thinks he's the top G. Jesus is the top G.
Jesus is.
Yeah.
Andrew Tate is allegedly a pedophilic rapist. Whereas Jesus is not. He's also someone who would totally sue people for saying that.
Jesus saw the value in women and why they were created in the first place. The first people to see that Jesus resurrected were women. When we see all through the Bible how Jesus valued them. Andrew Tate doesn't really, based on his actions and the things he said about women, to really value them.
So obviously we have a moral framework in the biblical context through Christ and through the Father, and we all know the tenets of that are generally speaking. And then you compare Tate. He was quoted the other day on Twitter as saying, "If you only have one wife who you have children with, that you're homosexual." So that's it's hard to do.
I was just gonna say it's a commentary on like the nature of sin and him is like a deprivation of the good. When a good thing becomes the ultimate thing, it becomes a bad thing. And Jesus correctly oriented the goods of masculinity, whereas Andrew Tate took the goods of masculinity and made it the chief end in and of itself, pursued it, and therefore corrupted it.
I'll move on. That actually works perfectly. You guys are just making my segue so talking about more about the Bible, it talks about the good and how it should be used correctly. So, got another scripture. We got Colossians 3, 5 and 12. Would one person like to read 5 and one person like to read 12?
I'll read 5.
5
You
and
can
12.
read 5.
I can read.
Okay, but
Just learn how to read. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly use, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry.
put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience.
So these are like almost side-by-side comparisons, of what you shouldn't do and what you should do. And personally, I would say they parallel quite well with the people we've been talking about. Yeah. That's all I have for that. But just wanted to show that comparison there. I thought it was cool that they were, 7 verses apart? Next one. Someone like a joke?
Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong, let all that you do be done in love.
For this one, the first part, it does sound like very manly, and it's like, be strong, act like men. And then the next sentence, which is verse 14, let all that you do be done in love. And it kind of adds to the whole power and reserve part, right? Where what you're doing needs to have some sort of purpose behind it. And we speak the truth in love, we act in love. Like how men are supposed to be strong in love. It's adding a qualifier for what the thing that you are doing is. Julian?
I hope you're not talking about this in the presentation because I don't want to spoil anything, but Andrew says he became a Muslim because Christianity is weak. He sees it as being weak, but that's related to this because it's really not weakness, it's meekness. It's intentionally holding back to the betterment of other people, but you just can't see that.
Yeah. He is directly opposed to Christianity.
Yeah.
For that reason. He sees Christian men as weak, he sees Christ as weak. He would see someone dying for someone else is weak because you're not. So it goes down to the core of what he believes. Again, like what he's doing and telling people to do. Whereas Paul says that there's no greater act that a friend can do than lay down his life for another. So, yeah. And this last one is, I used it in my presentation with feminism as well, but it gives the example of, or instructions relating the relationship between women and men and generational relationships. Would someone like to read this one? It's a little bit longer.
Sure. But as for you, teach in accordance with sound doctrine. Older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness. Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, and submissive to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. Likewise, urge the younger men to be self-controlled.
So this one, what stands out to me is we talked about the very polar opposites between femininity and masculinity at this time. And just like the feminine side, it seemed so different for the Bible to say that women should be submissive and kind and working at home. And we can talk about all the womenly stuff later. But just like how that was very different, in the same way, it's encouraging the young men to be self-controlled, which is exactly the opposite of what society and Andrew Tate is saying. He's saying, if you have a desire, act on it. Do what you want, because that's just showing how powerful or how controlling of your own life you can be, as opposed to, no, actually the most controlling thing you can do is having control of yourself, which is self-control. Yeah. Yes.
I didn't even think about this until you just said it, but he tells men to be in control of their own lives, but really he's telling them to be slaves to their sins of choice.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thing.
It's the worst possible thing for them, even though he's advertising it as the best.
Because like they're so ingrained in sin, they can't even see it wrong.
Right.
It's acting on the male ego even more.
Well, Julian says,
So,
if you believe you are looking, you think you've found what you're looking for, you're never gonna have any motivation to change that. So if you think this is the thing to go forward, it's worse than being stuck and knowing that you're stuck.
yeah. So, it'd be better for Steve to still be stuck than to find this and go along with it. So what makes Christ's model morally correct in contrast with Andrew Tate's model? Because we can talk about like the benefits or like the reason behind why they do what they do, but what makes it
Well, because he was God, so what he teaches is right.
yes. Yep, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what makes anything like morally correct as opposed to not, right? Like it has to be grounded on something. So like, what is Andrew Tate's like model grounded on? But like, yeah, like except for like self-pleasure, right? So you have like self-pleasure on one hand, and on the other hand, you have this much like deeper like ontological status, right? Of the morally good, being grounded in like God's very nature and all that.
And when you look at it that way, it's almost no longer a comparison. Like this other thing seems so little and insignificant. Like yes, people are following it and everything, but there's no grounding to it. Like if he changes his mind and he's like, hey, this thing's actually better, then does everyone go along with it? Because there's no root to what they believe.
Yeah, and that's the same for any naturalistic framework, right? It's not just the debauchery that is Andrew Tate's. It's like anything that's grounded in naturalism is going to just fall apart.
I like to think of this analogy with what you're saying, Forrest, was think of like us in like a boat, like we are a boat, and we're going through life, and the ocean of life, you could say, it's like ups and downs, it's hard waters. Andrew Tate's essentially telling you to tether the boat to itself, and you're just still completely subject by arbitrary desires and whims. Whereas Christ's model is saying, tied to the dock, that dock being the rock in which you build your life, the only thing that you can place the weight of your soul upon is the one that created it. And sure, the boat's still going to move around, life is still hard, but it's tethered into the nature of something.
I was gonna say, kind of backing up into a more naturalistic framework, but still within the Christian model. You have the conflict between short-term gratification and long-term satisfaction. With the Manosphere model, it's all based around the short term, and then with the Christian moral model, it's obviously you have a long-term goal, both temporally and then in eternity. So you get a lot of like high versus low time preference stuff in there, denying that short-term gratification in favor of a long-term satisfaction.
Because we're still like presented with these choices of whether or not to do what Andrew Tate is advocating for, but because we know and because we are willing to forego something in the short term for something even greater in the long term, like Joe said, then that's why we do what we do. So a couple of like the core things that I want you guys to take away from this is sacrifice and the importance of sacrifice. Why does that matter? Why does the story at the beginning matter? Why does Christ's sacrifice matter? Why do people who don't sacrifice anything but just want to gain everything, why does that matter? Self-discipline, the self-control. What does it mean to be disciplined, and why is that more manly than just doing whatever you want is? The ultimate submission to God. So just like there are examples of submission within these stories, ultimately we all are under the submission to God and what He tells us to do, which is where we get the moral anchor from. And valuing other humans as made in the image of God, whether it's men, whether it's women, how we act and how we go about in this world should be seeing each person as someone who God made and His image is in them. So, with those last couple of things.
You know, in the Bible it talks about, like, Paul gives instruction, I think it's Corinthians, like, man is to be the head of woman and man is to Christ.
Yeah.
So the man being head of woman, I just thought your thoughts, is that being, chauvinist, is that going to Manosphere, or is it? I know the answer is no, but I just wanted to talk about, for men to be pastors, but women aren't really not pastors. Is that, the answer is no, it's not male chauvinist, but why? How could somebody who doesn't really know the Bible well look at that and say that's not male chauvinist?
Yeah, Joe, do you have
So I think the way to answer that is to look into the differences between men and women specifically, and and then play out the consequences from there. Men are called to be the heads of the house because, for one, that's what they were created for in the beginning, and then everything plays out from there. You can even take it within a naturalistic framework of like the men are generally stronger, so on and so forth, and therefore, like in any sort of a tribal setting, will take that power. And obviously, we have the moral grounding for that within the framework of our creation. So I think it's important to recognize those differences and then look in the biblical framework and try to apply that. If that answers your question.
I know all the scriptures.
One thing, when it says that, and it's Ephesians 5, right, I believe, where it says that the husband is to be the head of the house, and just as Christ is the bridegroom for the bride of the church, what did Christ do for the church? He laid His life down. And so to say that is chauvinistic would be the exact opposite. What Christ did to the church was sacrifice his entire life, and that is what Paul is calling husbands to do in that moment, in the context of that verse.
it's not lording something over women, but instead taking on the responsibility and being willing to lay down your life for someone.
Each has their logical role.
Yes.
This is just a kind of random question. You said that Andrew Tate became a Muslim because he thought Christianity was weak. And I don't know much about Islam, but I was curious if there was if anybody had understanding of what it was about Islam that made him think that like he can like get away with like what he indulges in more in Islam than Christianity, and like, or is he just like a really bad Muslim?
Boy, can we tell you some
Yeah.
stuff.
Which one of you two wants to chop it like that?
I want to work on it. Okay. You can be harsh. So, for example, with women, Islam teaches you, and this is straight from the Quran, Islam teaches you can have up to 4 wives and then as many sex slaves as you like. You can beat them
They can't be
if
Muslim
they...
women though.
Huh?
The sex slaves, they can't themselves be Muslim.
Yes, that's
As
fair.
a caveat.
That doesn't say it, but you can beat your wives if they become unruly and they refuse to have sex with you. You can divorce them for any reason. All kinds of carnal stuff. You just look into the life of Muhammad. He's supposed to be the role model for Muslims everywhere, and he, not allegedly, was a pedophile and a murderer and warlord and a
According to Muslims.
He waited a couple years, right?
He did wait a few years.
No, it's terrible stuff. And that's the guy that Muslims are told follow him. And you contrast him with Jesus, where Jesus defies everybody's expectations and everything that they expected of him to be the Messiah and all that kind of stuff. He said, that's not good enough. I'm going to do something you don't expect and lay down my life for the entire world. So I understand why Andrew Tate says it's weak, because he doesn't understand the eternal perspective of Christ. He just sees the here and now, just looking at the pleasures you can get right away. And Christianity tells you to deny those pleasures. So for him, it looks weak, because that's what he thinks is strong.
Also, to be fair, he's not actually a Muslim. He just says he is.
Right. He's a Muslim as far as the sexual sins is concerned. But no, he doesn't pray 5 times a day or fast or Ramadan or any of that stuff.
I will say his criticisms of the church are generally pretty valid, temporally at least. When he says like the church is weak, and he means that from a standpoint of weak men, particularly. His criticism is pretty valid, in my opinion. I think over the last 100 years or so, the church is feminized isn't the best word to use, but it's an appropriate term in the sense that it's moved away from the framework set out throughout Paul's epistles into a more egalitarian framework, and it's kind of emasculated a lot of men in the church. We're starting to see a revival now of biblical masculinity, and there's a lot of guys putting out a lot of good work about that. I got a few book recommendations if anyone's interested. But throughout the last, really since I guess the origin of this Jesus movement in the '60s with all the hippie stuff, but even going before that, you got a lot of churches that they adopted stuff like the tolerating divorce, for instance, and then a lot of the sexual stuff, and so forth. A lot of worship, as you said, has gotten towards more feeling stuff, and a lot of guys that are coming into the church will go to certain places, and it's not very appealing to the masculine spirit to sing Jesus is my boyfriend songs. So there's a lot of guys that are looking at that and they're like, what is this, and luckily there's a revival going on of tradition in the sense of restoring the church to what it was even 150 years ago. Regardless of your denomination, every denomination is kind of going through this. We're seeing like a return to like liturgies and pastors taking strong stands, and I think a lot of that will help bring back that biblical masculinity.
Just kind of side back to the Islam stuff. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think the eschatology, the end times views of Islam revolves around seeking power. It's like I believe it's the belief that things will occur once everyone subjects themselves to Allah. Not that they worship Him, but that they subject themselves to Him. So like even if it's by force of people that you would take over a country. So
yeah, that's how it was spread as well. That's the beginning and the end of Islam.
And also part of it is like it tells you to only attack when they're weak.
Yes.
So like there's not a lot of honor in that. And when your entire idea of how the end goal of Islam is to subject others to it, it is probably appealing for someone like Tate.
If you want more information on Islam, in that regard, you should read Defenders of the West is a good one, but Sword and Scimitar by Raymond Ibrahim. It's a history of all of the Islamic and Christian conflicts the last 1,700 years, roughly 1,500 years. He's like the foremost English language scholar on Islam.